Thank you, everyone who has joined us today. Some of you are still filing in, but I'm very excited to be hosting this webinar today with some amazing leaders in the martech space. So I'm Jessica Vogol. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at OfferFit, and I'm very fortunate to be joined today by Scott Brinker and George Khachatryan. Scott is the VP of Platform Ecosystem at Hubspot and also the editor of Chief Martech. So I'm sure all of you have been following his insights for many years about how the space has been evolving. George Khachatryan is the CEO of OfferFit and one of our co-founders, and also just, probably the smartest person I've ever spoken to about AI and machine learning. So I was very lucky to get to host this chat today. We are not going to share slides, but I want to encourage our guests ask questions in the chat. We will be happy to answer them throughout the course of this conversation. So with that, I'd love to pass it over to Scott and George to introduce themselves and talk a little bit more about what brought your fascination and what brought you into the martech space. So Scott, do you want to go first?
Sure. I see Jason Siba, martech geeks unite. I love it. Yeah, so I guess I've been on this martech journey probably a couple decades at this point. And back when I started, like the world of marketing and the world of like IT and technology and software, they were pretty much from your high school guidance counselor would have been on absolute opposite ends of the career spectrum. But yeah, I mean, of course, it became clear, that as we moved into the digital age, like these two universes were going to collide and entangle in all sorts of amazing ways. And so, yeah, I've been fascinated by that, for the past couple decades. Part of it is the technologies itself, because there's been a lot of innovation, a lot of new capabilities that have been unlocked for marketers over this time frame. But to be honest, as much of it's like the change to the marketing organization, the way the talent that is a part of the marketing organization, how this impacts the way we think about marketing strategy. Sort of at the end of the day, the technology is a great, power and capability, but it's what you do with it around it where all the magic happens.
Very cool. George.
Yeah, for my part, I'm a newer joiner of the marketing and martech world. About 5 years ago was when I became one of the martech geeks uniting today. I'm a mathematician by training. I met Victor, my co-founder for OfferFit, about 17 years ago when we were doing our math PhDs together at Cornell. And then a lot of math people over time ended up going into machine learning because, of course, machine learning and AI recently has had, obviously a huge explosion, but this has been an ongoing process for the last 20 plus years. And so most of my friends ended up one way or another going into machine learning over time. And so Victor, many years after we met, he was with the Boston Consulting Group building custom machine learning models for marketers. Because by 10 years ago today, that was already happening. That process, Scott, that you described of technology and marketing colliding was well on its way. And he started using a type of machine learning that we can talk about later if folks are interested, called reinforcement learning, which has agents that select what actions to take and do essentially autonomous AI decisioning. And then he thought that there was a way this could be productized. And that became OfferFit. And for my part, I was just a mathematician who was friends with Victor and thought it would be really nice to build a company together. We talked to people that we knew in our network who were marketers and asked them if this was something that met a need that they had, and they seemed to think it was an unmet need, and that's how I got into this.
I love the origin story.
Very cool and very different, and unique sides and approaches to how you got here. So, George, I know you said you're a newer entrant, but OfferFit's been around for 4+ years. And as you said, 10 years ago, there was a fit for this. And Scott, you've seen the Lumascape expand, so you've seen a lot of evolution. So what are the biggest changes and evolutions that you've seen in MarTech in like the last 5 years? Either one, whoever
Scott,
wants.
you want to start?
All right. Well, I mean, the easy answer to that is, one of my projects, my side hobbies, boy, I need to get some new hobbies, has been like this annual MarTech landscape that tries to like capture on one slide oh boy, like all the different commercial technologies, products out there we see in the space, which, over a decade or so went from several hundred, which seemed like a lot at the time, to literally an explosion of thousands and thousands. The one from last year had over 14,000. So one thing you could look at is you could say simply the number of software solutions out in the market in this category has grown tremendously. And we'll probably come back to this in some of our later discussions because it has some interesting implications of what AI can do for all of this. But I would say a couple of the other things that have been really interesting to see here is, boy, if we weren't talking about AI all the time, we'd be talking about this evolution of the data layer inside martech. I mean, you go back 5 years ago, pretty much every single one of these martech applications was its own little database silo. And our vision of integration at the time was like taking tiny little bits and throwing them over the wall from one silo to another that was not particularly efficient. But what we've seen here over the past 5 years is really this convergence towards the concept of like a universal data layer. Not only just connecting data across different applications of marketing, but more importantly, connecting data across other touch points and other processes across the whole organization. For a while, we kind of thought the whole CDP movement was going to be that organizing function to converge that data in the marketing department. And there's still a role for CDPs at different layers, in what happens in marketing. But really, the big news had been like the cloud data warehouse, lakehouse, like that whole space. Like that's really the thing that has shifted the availability of data across the entire martech ecosystem inside companies. And of course, then this does feed back into AI because it's such an incredible unlock on what we can do with some of these AI technologies.
Mm-hmm. George, what would you add?
Yeah, I think there's kind of an interesting way of looking at what's happening in the data layer that's been playing out over especially the last couple of years. As Scott mentioned, initially there was this enthusiasm over CDPs, and now obviously that whole category is struggling. Like we've seen a lot of consolidation where CDPs are getting acquired, and not in a good way, just to be very blunt about it, right? And so what happened? The way that at least I look at it, and I'm interested in your take, Scott, is initially when there was this enthusiasm about CDPs, there were two distinct but related value propositions that everyone was hoping they would get from CDPs. The first is unifying data. So you have data, as you mentioned, Scott, in all these different systems of record. You need to bring it together to where you have a customer 360, because if you don't have data in a convenient place, how are you going to ultimately personalize and make the right decisions for people? And then the second value proposition, which was almost an afterthought to this, was the way people looked at that, was then using that data to make the right decisions. It was decisioning. And the thinking was, well, if you have the data, the decisioning is going to be pretty easy, right? Some kind of machine learning, black box, solves the problem, you're done. And I think what happened is people found in practice that second piece was really hard. And so you had a lot of enterprises that would have these very big projects to unify their data, and that's necessary and essential. But then they'd find that bridging the gap between even that beautiful, clean, unified data and making the right decisions to activate is not so straightforward. And they were using these very clunky methods in CDPs, but they're still fundamentally clunky processes of dividing people into segments, trying to figure out the right rules of what to do for which segment, running a bunch of A/B tests to try to derive what are the right rules. And this just doesn't scale. They found that it didn't go anywhere. And so that caused churn problems where people would set up the CDP and then they had trouble getting value out of the CDP. And then concurrently, what happened is data warehouses came along, and data warehouses said, hey, our value proposition is just going to be the first. We're just the data warehouse. We're not going to try to solve your decisioning problem necessarily. We'll give you some tools, but and then that becomes a more attractive solution because it's less expensive. And so you see migration from CDPs to warehouses happening in a lot of companies. And so our view is that, in fact, that afterthought before of decisioning, that's not the afterthought. That needs to be that's really hard, and you need to be a specialist as a product to provide that, and it needs to be provided with expert services because decisioning isn't easy. And so you need to be using the right type of machine learning. You need to be making really heavy R&D investments in that. And that's what I see as the future over the next few years, is that appearance of that decisioning layer, not as an afterthought, but as an actual product category that focuses on that to the right degree that product deserves to be focused on, because it's not easy. And it'll hook up to CDPs or warehouses or some combination of both. I think there's still going to be a place for CDPs in that world, but that decisioning layer is the main course. It's not something you can just think of as an afterthought. It's going to solve itself.
Yeah, I think the scale piece there is like really crucial. So way back in the early days of my journey in MarTech, I ran a company that had a platform to let marketers do A/B testing of landing pages and landing experiences, which at the time seemed absolutely state of the art. But you're exactly right. It's like, okay, you know, even having dedicated systems and software to quote unquote scale A/B testing, you're talking about scaling from maybe 1 or 2 experiments to, oh, now we could do several dozen experiments. Maybe if you had a staff dedicated to this, like, okay, potentially, whew, you know, we could have a whole team that focuses maybe on 100 A/B tests, you know, over a given quarter. And then all the strange interaction effects that you're trying to sort out between that, you know, like counteracts a bunch of that. And so like in parallel, this thing of having both on one hand, you know, the cloud data warehouse, giving marketers access to like a much wider range of like potential data inputs, you know, that they could theoretically make decisions on, you know, and on the other side of the equation, when you think of that explosion of all these different MarTech tools, one of the reasons there's been such an explosion of them is so many of them are actually at the engagement layer. There are these different touch points. They very much mirror the fact that over time, the number of different channels and touch points we have with customers, you know, the range of choices you have there has continued to multiply. And then when you start trying to say like, okay, well, we've got, you know, all these different data factors here, you know, we've got all these possible engagement things. We've got now all sorts of bunch of different ideas of what we might want to execute. I mean, yeah, just the math becomes impossible to be able to like manually manage that. And so I think, yeah, the sort of the rise of an AI solution to be able to do that in a more systematic and intelligent way, it's like the perfect match to the solution at the time the problem and the pain is most felt.
And Scott, I'd add just to what you said at the top of the webinar around it's not just the tools, it's really having like the strategy and the people to support too. I think that's been, you know, interesting to see how it's evolved and what George mentioned, like you really need that expertise.
Absolutely.
So my next question is obviously as we go through different economic environments and changes, what marketers need in their tools may change as well. So how, and I'll start with you, George, how do you see changes in the macro environment, you know, interest rates, cost of capital, how has that impacted what marketers might need from their stack or their partners that they're working with?
I think it certainly increased the prominence of CRM, also called lifecycle marketing. It used to be called customer marketing, right? Back in the day. But basically, in the growth at all costs world, it was all about acquisition, which is nice and shiny and flashy. And I always felt even then, even in 2021, which was the peak of the growth at all costs, it was still kind of misplaced. Like, yes, acquisition is great, but your existing customer base is such a major driver of value for most enterprises. And so being able to retain your customers, cross-sell to your customers, ensure repurchase, that was actually, even at growth at all costs, really was important, but it was neglected by companies because it was underinvested relative to acquisition, which was easier to tell the story. Hey, we got X new customers. Everyone can understand that. It sounds, great. We did it through TikTok. We did it through the metaverse. And I think with interest rates going down, the corporate finance impact that has is acquiring a new customer, even an identical customer, is less valuable now than it was with lower interest rates. Because if you think about a new customer, that is, to use corporate finance lingo, that is a stream of future cash flows. And so you're paying some customer acquisition cost today to acquire a stream of future cash flows. Cash flows that are further out are worth less when interest rates are higher. And so because the time value of money changes based on the interest rates. And so when interest rates go up, acquiring a customer who's only going to pay back in a long time no longer becomes attractive. And so then companies can't put as much money into acquisition marketing. And so they dial back the acquisition spend. Like, well, we still need to grow. Where are we going to focus? Let's focus on customer marketing. And so you're seeing lifecycle or CRM marketing have more focus. Certainly, we see that as an AI solution in CRM. People are saying, hey, CRM is a priority, AI is a priority, what's at the intersection? And that's driving a lot of conversations we're having with companies. But I think it's just broadly true that CRM is finally getting the prominence that, frankly, I think it should have had even in the growth at all costs type.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting changes is um, for like the first couple decades of MarTech, it felt like the challenge was the relationship between the CMO and the CIO, and sort of these competing visions of like, okay, what technology we're going to use, what's going to be specific to marketing, what's going to be universal across the company. I'm not going to say like, all of those challenges are completely solved at this point, but I see a lot more like really productive, CMO, CIO collaborations. I think what's been new for CMOs is in this economic environment, the role and the relationship between the CFO and the CMO. We sort of came out of that period where, boy, I remember just before pre-pandemic, I'm going to bring up a phrase that we haven't heard in a long time, digital transformation, right? Everyone had like, yes, we have a digital transformation agenda. Everyone I talked to in an enterprise had something like a 10-year digital transformation plan. And here's how we're going to get there in 2030, and then, yeah, with the chaos, of 2020, one of the most remarkable things is digital transformation didn't happen in 10 years. It happened pretty much in a year, and so much of the focus was both internally on the way that marketing operated, but also, greater and greater engagement with, customers and prospects through digital channels. That just became the overriding mission, and not so much even like growth at all cost, but just even like adapting to truly being digital in the way we run and the way we engage with people at all costs. And so no one was really paying a whole bunch of attention to the cost. It was like, let's just make this happen. And then as the pandemic started to recede, then there was this sort of rationalization moment of like, okay, wait, now what's really working? What do we need? Let's start to rationalize what our stack is, our operations. And as the economic environment, got tighter and tighter, now the CFO really started to lean in on like, okay, spending a lot of money on marketing technology here. We need to analyze which of these capabilities are actually delivering return for the company. And I think you saw some stuff that got taken out of the stack because it wasn't. And I think you've seen some things that you can relate to that have actually gotten widely embraced because they can be directly attributed to the ROI impact they're having for those businesses. And I guess one thing I'd say about this is also like, of course, filtered upstream into the actual creation and the funding of new MarTech companies, is if you don't have a clear case of how you're going to deliver ROI to your customers in a way that's compelling, frankly, for that matter, as a MarTech company, if you don't have a reasonably clear vision of like, how are you going to get to even profitability in this too, it's just very hard to get funding. But we still see MarTech companies getting funding because those who are able to focus on what is the actual economic value delivered to our customers, and sort of what is our model to, eventually become a truly profitable business, they're now part of the equation. I think it's a great thing. It's made us a lot more disciplined, on both the supply and demand side of how we think about MarTech.
Yeah, and that's a great a call out. I'll just tie it back very quickly, Jason, to your comment about the CFO and CMO relationship, and Scott around one of the things at OfferFit is that we are fully focused on a commercial KPI and not kind of like a value of a softer engagement. So I had to get a little plug in there.
Well done.
My marketing hat on. So, you just mentioned digital transformation, another buzzword that I've loved, big data 2.0, many around AI. But the one that is buzziest right now seems to be agentic AI. So can you talk a little bit about like what is that and what does that amount to in practice? Scott, you want to get started?
Wow. Yeah. Agentic AI. I mean, what do you want it to mean? That seems to sort of be the answer most people are taking. Um, I guess the way, all right. So I'm actually going to save some of this for George because he's truly the expert,
Yes.
on thinking what is actually a true agent, in a technical sense of the word. But I think the thing that's been most interesting is the way in which we look at what we used to consider applications that were largely commercial package solutions that had a whole bunch of capabilities that we'd never want to get in the middle of, playing around with, and then things that were a little bit more configurable that were typically what we thought of as automations. Like if you think about people configuring, marketing automation workflows or things like this that were like very deterministic, and usually the scope of what you were structuring in a marketing automation workflow was, in the grand scheme of things, relatively narrow. And I think what we're seeing is a pretty significant change in the architecture of MarTech stacks is the things that people are in a position to be able to automate, that they're able to bring some of their own process logic to. It's sort of expanding scope. It's no longer just these marketing automation workflows within, say, like a customer engagement platform or a marketing automation platform. It's starting to increasingly be things that like span multiple different apps, multiple different customer touch points. One of the things I've been sort of brainstorming a bit with folks on LinkedIn here over the past few weeks, is we used to talk a lot about, oh, there were systems of engagement and there were systems of record. And there's always been a bit of a blending between what is a system of record and a system of engagement for a lot of products. But to me, this environment where we have this agentic technology is that we're starting to think more and more about systems of context, for a very specific context, whether it's for an internal marketer or even an external like customer experience, like how good are we at getting at understanding the context of what they're trying to do in that moment, sort of the job to be done, and can we deliver an experience, whether it's to the employee or to the customer, that's really tailored to that. I think that's sort of the way in which you think a lot of people from a popular perspective think about this agentic capability in marketing.
Yeah.
Now, George, you got to tell me why that's a completely wrong definition.
No, I don't
thinking about this.
I don't think it's wrong at all. I don't think it's wrong at all, Scott. Let me I'll add a sort of historical or etymological view of this term, agentic. So this is a term that's been in the machine learning research literature for many years. And if you look at machine learning, for kind of non-experts, they often think of it all as a monolith, but there's actually different subfields of machine learning where you have different types of models for different purposes. And so you might have heard these terms: supervised learning, unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning. So supervised learning is when you have a machine learning model whose job is to make a prediction. So a good example in marketing is, let's say you want to have churn scores for customers. So you'd like to predict how likely on a scale of 0 to 100 is each customer to churn in some time horizon, like 6 months. And so you're going to set up a supervised model. The reason it's called supervised is because you would train the model on historical data of actual customers who churned or didn't churn. And so you have labels, ones and zeros. The customers with ones churned, the customers with zeros didn't churn. And so you give those labels and you use them to train. And so you think of those labels as supervising the education of this model, right? Your model sees the labels, that gives it the reality. And if it predicts something that doesn't correspond to a label, it gets a slap on the wrist. And if it predicts something that does correspond, good job. So you can think of these labels as supervising the training process of the model. Notably, supervised models like churn prediction, they don't make decisions. They don't tell you what to do. They don't take actions in the world. They make predictions. You can think of them, it's a model that sits in an armchair and it tells you, this customer will churn, this customer will churn. It doesn't do anything about it. It's a thinker, not a doer. And then you have another branch of machine learning called reinforcement learning, where here you had models whose job is to actually take actions. So you have a reinforcement learning model. Instead of telling it to predict something, you tell it, hey, here's a reward function that you want to maximize. So that reward function, you can think of it as like goodies that the model gets when it takes actions that lead to good outcomes. In the case of marketing, that could be conversions or revenue dollars, whatever. And then it has a set of actions it's allowed to take, and then it actually starts taking actions and getting goodies or anti-goodies, right? You can get negative goodies if you do bad things. And it's like training an animal. And what a reinforcement learning model is supposed to do is it's supposed to learn through its own trial and error what set of actions to take to maximize the total reward that it's achieving. Just like a puppy, if anyone's ever trained a puppy, it's the exact same analogy. And so in the research literature, reinforcement learning models have traditionally been called agents. And because that word underscores that distinction between a model whose job it is to just make some prediction and an entity that acts in the world and has some goal that it's pursuing and then takes actions to maximize its attainment of that goal. And so traditionally, that was the distinction. A model is something like a supervised model. An agent is a reinforcement learning model that actually takes actions to maximize something. And then more recently, with large language models, the term agent has been also borrowed from the reinforcement learning literature to say a large language model who actually doesn't just output text. It also takes certain actions, like it browses the internet or it sends emails. and it's kind of specifically tuned and set up in order to take these actions instead of just purely outputting text and predicting what sort of text you'd have. And so it's a similar concept, but it's actually distinct, right? Reinforcement learning agents are not identical to large language model agents, but the terminology reflects the same idea and the same way of thinking about them.
I love that. That was really helpful. Thanks so much for going through that.
Sure.
So we've talked a lot about, the changes that you've seen, and, none of us have a crystal ball, but obviously we know that as fast as technology is moving, there will continue to be more changes. So how do you view these impacting the technologies that marketers are using and the way that they are using these types of technology? And George, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think AI decisioning, obviously this is why I'm spending my time on OfferFit and AI decisioning. I think its time is here. Like if you look at, there's one question that came up is, do you need a CDP, for example, in order to use OfferFit or any kind of generic AI decisioning solution? And as I answered in the chat, you don't need a CDP, but you need to have unified your data. That's a change that's happened. Like 10 years ago, most companies hadn't made a lot of progress in having any kind of customer 360, whether it's in a CDP or a warehouse. That's no longer true. Today, you go talk to an enterprise, the majority of them, no one's perfectly happy with their data unification and their 360, but everyone's made at least some sort of progress. Likewise, on the activation side, there are increasingly modern systems that companies use for email, SMS, push notifications, et cetera, for their customers. And they've been doing this kind of digital transformation to move from older generation outdated systems to more modern ones. And so the time is ripe for that kind of missing middle piece, which is the intelligence layer. And which is going to take in the customer 360 and have these reinforcement learning agents that can then make the right decisions to then be activated through the activation layer. And so I think that's going to be a huge change. We're obviously seeing it show up in things like OfferFit's growth rate, but I think that trend's going to continue because it's just everybody's going to need to have some sort of solution for this. An implication for marketers is when they're learning about AI, it's not just ChatGPT. Obviously that's important too in generating text. But I think it's important for marketers to get really close to all the different flavors of AI that are going to be in the stack, including AI decisioning and reinforcement learning, because this is going to become a required part of the marketer's toolkit within the next few years.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way I think of it is, for every martech system throughout history, you could break it down into 3 layers, and I will credit David Robb, the person who coined CDPs to begin with his model of like, okay, there's data, there's decisioning, and there's delivery. And the reality is, for a lot of martech products, they sort of tightly coupled all of these, bundled these things together. And I think what we're seeing now is these things being decoupled in very powerful ways. As we were talking earlier here about this universal data layer of a cloud data warehouse. I mean, one of the big advantages of this is it completely opens the landscape of what's possible from a data layer. There's, in fact, you could argue the challenge of it is there are no constraints except those. So you have to get more disciplined at imposing the constraints you want, but you're completely free to define what are the right constraints for your business. It's not predefined by like any particular application vendor. I think what's equally exciting here on the other side is, again, these we had thought of as systems of engagement. Again, this was mostly software that was pre-developed, hardwired particular ways by the companies that built those products. It just really wasn't feasible for marketers, for different businesses to be creating more and more like bespoke experiences or touch points on their own, because it required all this advanced programming and maintenance of that. And so what's really exciting here with some of the AI technology on even just like the programming side, or these agents, or this ability to like democratize the way in which we develop things, is I think you're going to see, boy, if you thought the martech landscape had an explosion of engagement touch points when it was all commercial software, I think we're looking at a world where like the amount of custom engagement touch points that businesses are going to be able to craft leveraging these AI tools is going to, like, orders of magnitude explode. Now this is really interesting because now you've like, okay, decoupled these things into what is essentially an incredibly flexible data layer on one side. And then on the other end of the equation is this entirely malleable, open for creative experimentation, engagement side, you know, okay, but how do you orchestrate this? How do you keep all this stuff actually working together? And this is why I buy into the thesis here, that it is that decisioning layer that really provides the brain, to how to connect these different tissues. And like almost the more flexibility you have at the data layer and the more flexibility you have at the engagement layer, the more power you get, in being able to have the true orchestration of a company's business happening at that, decisioning layer.
Mhm.
Put another way, the more complexity there is, the higher the need for intelligence, right? To sort through all the complexity, both on the data side and on the engagement side.
Absolutely. Scott, to kind of call back to one of the things that you mentioned earlier, but just now too. So as things change, things are more nebulous and open. How do marketers think about building their teams or like creating new roles and how to structure like the human side of operationalizing that? Are you seeing different roles or teams emerge in the marketers that you talk to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. So, if we look at if we oversimplify and we say maybe there's been three kinds of roles in marketing. There was sort of strategic and creative roles, which have always been the most prized. Like when anyone actually talks about marketing, that's what they're envisioning, the strategy and creative roles. But you might be able to relate to this, Jess. As far as like total amount of time and calories that we just spent on strategy and creative, it's been relatively constrained. There's another side, in my world on MarTech where, we've certainly invested calories in marketing operations and marketing technology. But as most marketing ops leaders will tell you, too, I mean, relative to the scale of the marketing department and all, that's not where the majority of calories have been spent. The vast majority of calories in marketing have gone to what if I can, again, oversimplify, but just sort of bucket into the production and analysis work. And don't get me wrong, it's incredibly valuable because, the strategy and creative, like it wouldn't have been able to come to life without all the work that was being done, on that production and analysis. But this is where so much of the innovation that we're seeing around AI tools from a, like internal management perspective are unlocking power is they are, if not completely eliminating production and analysis work, they're basically giving people tremendous leverage, that any one individual, like the amount of production or analysis that they're able to, directly be able, deliver or manage. Yeah, it's like an order of magnitude different than before. And so to me, what's really exciting is, the that sort of shift of where calories go is I don't think it just like those calories just have to go away. I think the, reducing the amount of calories and investment that has been required in production and analysis gives us an incredible opportunity to invest more in the strategy and creative, and I don't know any marketer that I've met anywhere in my entire career. Okay, well, maybe a few, but categorically, every market I know is just like a font, of ideas and experiments and things that they're eager to run. They have these theses, these hypotheses that they're eager to be able to try out, and they've just been limited, by the costing and the resources and the time required to make that happen, And so by like, reducing, those costs and that overhead and shortening those time frames, boy, I think you're unlocking for those marketers that are willing to embrace it, like this incredible opportunity to lean into greater experimentation, greater innovation. And so I think seeing a shift of the calories and investment there and the roles, you hire for that is a great opportunity. And then the only thing I would say on the other side of that too is I think to make that all work the way you want, I also think that marketing operations, MarTech team, and even their like compatriots, in IT, in data engineering, like you really need to make sure those underlying systems, particularly at the data layer, are well structured and well managed to make sure that, okay, as the experimentation that's happening at, the strategy and creative side, that they're leveraging AI tools, all that stuff is actually operating, on an environment that's stable and reliable.
Mhm. And George, I know you're kind of speaking to CMOs probably daily. Are you hearing anything about how they're thinking about operationalizing any shifts?
I mean, I think the problems are that they're working on are similar. They shift kind of gradually, right? It's like data was an issue. It's still a focus area, right? I still see companies, even if they've set up warehouses, CDPs, they're constantly working to improve the quality of that data. Relating to your point, Scott, right? Like that's one of the foundations that you need to have in place. Um, things like you constantly see companies upgrading their engagement platforms, right? They're still it's surprising how many companies are still on 30-year-old tools or 20-year-old tools that are like multiple generations behind, and they realize it, right? They know it's just a big lift. It's not easy. You have as a marketer, you're incredibly busy because there's such a wide range of things you need to do, and it seems to be growing. Even the number of channels, right, that marketers are looking after today are like way more than even 10 years ago. And so it's a thing a lot of companies just haven't gotten to, and now they're getting to. So and of course AI, right? One of the big things we hear from marketers and CMOs about AI is everybody knows that they need to use AI, but now it's no longer enough to just do shiny AI. You need to actually deliver financial value. And this relates to the point of the CFO and marketer relationship and the board, right? I think Jason mentioned in the chat that it goes all the way to the board, where I've talked to marketers where literally there's a board level discussion. How can we link AI deployment to dollars? And by the way, the board didn't invent that from scratch. That's because Wall Street analysts are asking these questions of public companies. It's like, hey, public company, what is the earning per share impact of your AI program? That's literally a question that like Wall Street analysts will ask, CEOs and other C-level executives of public companies. And so that translates into board pressure, and then marketing is thinking, okay, along with the rest of the C-suite, but marketing is often the first place people look. Is okay, how can I use AI in a way that's not just going to be a nice prototype or a nice flashy, example, but that's actually going to drive measurable financial value to the bottom line, which obviously impacts AI decisioning because that's one way to do it, but it's other types of AI that are practical AI. That's not just the flashy demo. That's the sort of AI you can actually measure the impact of.
Cool. Great. So we will definitely continue to take questions from the audience. If anyone has them, please throw them in the chat or Q&A. But the last question that I have for both of you is, what advice would you give a marketing leader who wants their team to better utilize AI, but they're not sure the best place to start or kind of wary of all the hype?
I mean, there is hype. Gartner's hype curve is alive and well. But I think one thing I would caution for those who are almost too skeptical about it is, the time distance between like the hype and how reality caught up to it. Boy, I mean, we were used to that being things that had like a multi-year lag time associated with it. And that's not what we see with a lot of what's happening in AI. I mean, these past 2 years, there's been nothing but like, oh, there's some trigger innovation, a bunch of hype, a bunch of people saying, nah, it can't actually do that. And then 2 or 3 months later, it actually starts doing that. And you're like, okay, all right, well, I guess we'll figure that out. And then the next one, And so I think this is something here where we just have to recognize, yes, there's hype, but boy, the speed at which reality is catching up to it is really unprecedented. And therefore, I think, encouraging teams, empowering teams to actually get hands-on experimentation with more and more of these tools is really the only pathway through it, because it's like really hard in the abstract and a very general to say like what is possible or isn't possible with this. A lot of it depends on the specific context. I suspect a lot of people in the audience here, are followers of Ethan Malik. If they're not, highly recommend following him. Wharton professor who's just sort of dived into weekly writing about like all his experimentations of like what's possible, what's not possible. And this is the number one advice he keeps giving to any executive that he consults is, you as an executive, you need to actually get your hands on and be working with this stuff, because it's not enough to just read about it. It is only really by learning through doing that starts to unlock these aha moments of like, oh yeah, this is what's possible, or no, this is still hype. This is not yet possible.
Very cool.
Yeah, what I'd add, which I think again dovetails with this, I think marketers should invest in understanding AI and machine learning, but not just at a surface level of, products that are on the market and how you could use those products. I think it actually pays to go deeper and try to get to like the foundations. Now, obviously, as a marketer, it's not practical to go get a, master's degree in machine learning. I'm not suggesting that, but it is worth setting aside some proportion of your time and your team's time and do certain trainings that will actually teach you like what is a machine learning model? Like really, what is it? Not just a paragraph about it, but like, build one, even if it's in Excel, but like build a simple machine learning model. You can do that in a day, even if you know nothing going into it. What are neural networks versus tree-based models? How are they different? Again, you may be listening to me and being like, George, that sounds crazy. Like, how are you going to learn a neural network? Neural networks actually aren't that difficult. Like, I promise you, everybody on this call, if you sat down at a good one-day training, you could leave that training with some understanding of what a neural network is. It's not some kind of incredibly complicated thing. It's actually very simple building blocks. What is supervised learning, unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning? How are they different from each other? Because at the end of the day, as marketers, to the point of hype, one of the problems of hype is it creates obfuscation. Right? And there are obviously a lot of interested parties where everybody now, every single MarTech vendor wants to talk about AI and paint themselves as AI and say, we have the shiniest, nicest type of AI. How do you separate the wheat from the chaff? How do you know, who's telling you the truth versus cases where people might be embellishing a little bit? And so you need to have that knowledge, both when you're selecting vendors and products, but also during implementation processes. It'll allow you as a marketer to have that discernment of like what's actually going to drive impact. How do you even measure that impact? How can you tell if a machine learning model is working? And so to me, I'd say, it's a little bit of going back to school, but I think setting aside 10, 20% of your team's time, as much as it's hard to say no to all the other things you need to do in order to go and develop that foundational knowledge, I think is just going to set up your team much better to navigate the complexity.
There's something here where I'm hearing, I 100% agree with you. And I'm having this deja vu moment where I remember, yeah, 10 years ago, as marketing operations was starting to become a thing and people wanting to go into marketing operations, the advice we gave them was you should learn how to program. Not because you actually want to do Java programming as part of what you're doing in marketing operations, but it's understanding that thinking of, how stuff works in a deterministic, process-driven approach. And yeah, you're exactly right. It's the same thing. There are new models, mental models here that AI is unlocking, and investing the time in learning how to create, a little neural network. Yeah, it isn't about like, okay, so you should now be the one going and building these neural networks, but actually understanding that will change how you approach, the implementation of this, the evaluation of both products and people that you want to bring into the org. So
that's a great analogy. That's a great analogy. Like saying, learn a little bit about programming. It doesn't mean go become a certified software engineer where you can build a standalone system, but maybe write a few lines of code. And it's the same thing with machine learning. You don't need to know how to train a transformer model, but maybe play with some tree-based models in Excel. And that that amount of understanding is already enough to take you from kind of bewilderment, which is a natural state for somebody who doesn't understand this, given all the hype and all the smoke that's going on, to actually having the analytical tools to sort through it.
And there was some data from MyCon last year that said exactly what you're both saying, that education is one of the biggest gaps. And so Scott, agree, like having this foundation of the different types of machine learning can help demystify and maybe be able to see through some of the buzz in a buying cycle. So super important. Great. So we have one question so far from our audience. What are some of the non-obvious marketing AI use cases that you're seeing? The geeky bleeding edge stuff was the specific ask.
about non-obvious, obvious is in the eye of the beholder, but there's been so much focus on leveraging generative AI for content. So let's just sort of maybe take that off the table. I think one of the things I find most exciting is, boy, the complexity of marketing technology has just completely gotten out of hand. And you see this, I think this shows up one of the reasons why utilization rates, that Gartner reports every year have been dropping like a rock, 5 years in a row. It's just because the technology, it's great technology, but it's become so sophisticated and you have to learn all these incantations to the user interface to figure out how to unlock it. And like mere mortals, we just don't have time for that, you know? And so you're starting to see more and more of these AI interfaces as a UI interface on marketing technology, that the more you can express things in natural language, it can then translate in like, oh, well, you wanted a report comparing this cohort to that cohort, you know, and then like, you know, be able to review, you know, which campaigns line up against that for the next quarter ahead. You can actually do that for you. And it doesn't even have to be a black box, because it's not just giving you one final answer on the out, you know, on the far end of it. It can actually like configure the reports for you. It can like list out the campaigns for you. And so you can verify that it is actually fulfilling the request you had of it.
Mm-hmm.
But you didn't have to learn all the like, okay, well, there's these 17 menu steps and this drop down and that radio button and which one does this other thing. It really is a huge democratization of this marketing technology. And I think what makes that really exciting is, I would argue, our inability for the user interface to keep up with what MarTech makes possible has actually been a huge constraint on us even leaning into more advanced and more sophisticated kind of MarTech. And when you decouple, the user interface can become simpler and simpler as the MarTech itself, the actual underlying engines, become more and more sophisticated. Boy, I think that's going to unlock just an incredible amount of innovation.
And so we got a question, do you know, or what tools are offering that today?
Well, almost every major MarTech product I know is now experimenting with some degree of these interfaces. So you mentioned at the beginning, one of the things I do is I work at HubSpot. You know, so HubSpot has a bunch of, boy, George, I hate to use this word in this context, but a bunch of agents, you know, the generative AI agents, you know, that again allow you to have like a natural language dialogue of what do I want the software to do for me, and then it can actually execute it for you. And I think a lot of these things are still just like the first generation of this. I think you see a few generative. God, you confuse the words generative. A few additional generations of this over the next couple of years. It's going to be amazing what people can do by literally just talking to their software.
That's awesome.
One type of kind of geeky use case I'm very excited about, which I haven't seen implemented yet, well, with one exception. It's using reinforcement learning to decide how to prompt large language models, like for marketing use cases. So because there is use of reinforcement learning for decisioning, like let's say you have these 10 different emails you could send somebody, which do you send to who, that are fixed templates? And then separately, people are doing things like generative AI chatbots, where you have a customer service conversation that you need, and you prompt your chatbot, and then you have a conversation with the chatbot. So the idea is marrying the two to where your reinforcement learning agent is choosing what prompts to give the chatbot in order to maximize the performance of the chatbot as measured by something like issue resolution or whatever you choose to give it as a reward. And that's obviously a very promising situation, because you can dramatically improve the quality of these chatbots because they're so sensitive to prompting. And so why not experiment on the prompting and then personalize the prompting to the individual? Like you could tell the chatbot, you know, tell jokes when talking to somebody who the data suggests they like jokes, and don't tell jokes to this other person, and it'll experimentally figure out how to prompt to maximize resolution. The one exception is this actually is being used by the large language model developers very extensively. So those of you who know these reasoning models, which now all the providers have, there's obviously the famous one with DeepSeek, but that's how they work, is that they're basically using reinforcement learning, at least in the case of DeepSeek, to prompt themselves to get themselves to like come up with the right answers. But this is a very sophisticated technique. So you don't really see this outside of like the top AI labs yet. But I think that's something that in the next year or two is going to hit like actual marketing use cases. And we've had a couple of marketers bring this up, and we're actually currently discussing that with them. And it's one that I'm particularly excited about, because I think it's going to be a pretty cool combination of two different cool technologies.
Wow. I'm sure if we checked back in 6 months, there will be all of this stuff probably is in mass market. So things are moving very quickly. Great. Are there any other questions from our audience? Otherwise, that concludes the questions that I have for today. Give it one more second. Well, George and Scott, thank you so much for your time and your insights into how the MarTech landscape's evolving and agentic AI, which I know is on everyone's mind. I really appreciate both of your time today. And to all of you who joined us, thank you so much. We have some exciting virtual events upcoming that we'll share about too, if you'd like to join us again and learn more about OfferFit and reinforcement learning. So thanks, everyone.